on the subject, have you noticed this contradiction that has been taking place in the materialistic worldview? So on the one hand, we have this notion that the world is overpopulated, okay, and that human life has evolved through natural means to the place that it is, and that only the strongest survive, right? Survival of the fittest, as we've heard all our lives, okay? Strongest people survive, and so that we should let that go in its natural order. People that slow down the system, the elderly, should be euthanized. Babies that are going to have deformities should be aborted, or babies that are going to inconvenience us should be aborted. Any excess life that slows us down, people with disabilities, should be gotten rid of, okay? Now the same crowd is telling us we have to stop the global economy, which, by the way, sustains human life. Let's not forget that.
Right.
We have to stop the global economy so that people will not die from this virus that they could be contracted.
Yes, this is so comical, the irony of what's going on.
Yes.
And the bankruptcy of the non-biblical worldviews just is in such stark relief right now. It's so easy to see. The same people, the environmentalists, who are telling us on the one hand that we need to dramatically reduce the global population. Now, when the global pandemic hits and there's chances for millions of people to die, are saying we need to shut everything down. Now, what they're really doing is, in time of crisis, they're borrowing from the Christian worldview and the Christian ideology, because their own worldview is so bankrupt. If we follow it to its logical conclusion, then we should welcome the global pandemic.
Absolutely.
And let all of these elderly, infirm, the weakest among us, just get out of the way and stop soaking up resources.
Exactly.
And of course, I'm not advocating that. I'm just saying.
But their worldview is
suggests
advocating that.
Exactly.
If you're going to be consistent with that worldview, the only logical thing to do, if this virus is taking those that are contributing the least, in their words, okay, those that are older, not working anymore, people that have severe lung conditions, smokers that have compromised systems, okay, in their worldview, you should let them be taken.
Exactly.
Okay, so then to stand up and say, no, we have to save these lives, where did you get that principle?
Right.
You stole it from Christianity.
Exactly. And the only reason that we have that principle is because, I think it's right here, in Genesis chapter 9, in verse 6, this is repeated from Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 and 27, but it says, "Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed." And here's the key takeaway: "For in the image of God made he man." What gives intrinsic value to human life is that all humans share in the imago Dei, the image of God.
Right.
We're all made in it. We all still have some of the image of God in us intrinsically, and that is what gives human life its intrinsic worth, which is why we should be doing everything we can to protect the elderly and the infirm and the unborn and everything else. But by their worldview, by Marxism, by radical environmentalism, by evolutionary biology, all these different worldviews, humanism, materialism, all these things that have taken over in academia and elsewhere, when the crisis actually comes, those worldviews are shown to be bankrupt. People cannot and will not actually live it out when we face it. So,
and this is one of the things that we have to have in order to have a solid worldview, right? It has to be viable.
It has to be viable.
It has to be livable. If we cannot be consistent with it, then it is false. If you cannot live it, then what good is it?
Exactly.
So I've just been just kind of enjoying seeing the worldview being torn apart.
Exactly.
And it's so interesting to me, any time that you want to hack at the God of Christianity because he is evil and he lets these things happen and so forth, you have to stand on his principles in order to call him bad.
Exactly.
What is bad? What is
right?
What
if
is
there
wrong?
is no God, there is no evil.
Exactly.
So exactly, this is a great irony in this time. It's shining the spotlight on the bankruptcy of those worldviews. Hopefully, many people will come to recognize that.
Yeah. So let me ask you a question here. If I'm dealing with somebody, okay, that has this worldview, I want to point out to them the contradiction so I can get them to think. What is the best way, in a loving manner, and not being arrogant, not being brash towards them, but what is an easy way in conversation to point out the inconsistency?
Well, that is a good question. It's very difficult sometimes to engage people in a loving and kind manner. The way I have been trained is to try to ask questions, leading questions, to invite people to think rather than just pointing out this is absurd,
Right.
and you're ridiculous for holding this worldview. Rather, just ask them questions. You espouse, let's say Marxism, for example, which that entails atheism, or you're a Darwinist and you think this. So isn't it the case in Darwinism that it should only be the survival of the fittest?
Right.
And then as they think through that and say answer yes, or then you slowly bring out the implications of that worldview until it dawns on them. I don't think it's wise to take a sledgehammer and just beat them over the head with it, because
Right.
they will shut down they're not going to be emotionally responsive to that. But if they can begin to see that there is an internal tension in their own worldview, the human mind cannot live with tension that it recognizes. It must try to reconcile that.
Right.
And so my goal is always to ask probing questions that lead them to that. And so I would, as you already said, just ask, doesn't it say survival of the fittest? Then why aren't we allowing all of the least fit among us to perish?
Right.
And then just linger with it. So.
Yeah. And it seems to me that the core issue is what you've pointed out here in Genesis 9, is that the reason we have an intrinsic value that is beyond any price tag you can put on it is because we are made in the image of God. Okay. If man is an animal, then he can have some kind of value that we can trade for him. But if it's a soul, if it's something that is invaluable, if we believe that every person, every baby, every elderly person, every person with a health disability, that they have value because they are human, I don't see how you could make that argument from a naturalistic standpoint.
No, you can't.
Because you are an animal.
Right, you can't make that argument from any standpoint other than the Bible. And so as soon as you get into some kind of a utilitarian argument, or they have value, or life is only exists when you can provide for yourself, or when you can do this, then all arguments for taking care of the elderly, or taking care of the newborn baby, for example, or anyone in a coma or a car accident immediately goes out the window. There's only one consistent worldview, and that is that human life is intrinsically valuable because all human life bears the image of God.